Remember your mutes. Good afternoon, I'm Helen Avery with the Green Finance Institute, and a very warm welcome back at the end of a great conference. This is our final investment readiness session this week, Lessons from the Journey, designed to support applicants to the fund, but also anyone interested in financing nature. So welcome to everyone. Like on Tuesday, we're going to have 4 presenters today who are going to be sharing their nature-based projects that are moving towards attracting private capital. And they're going to be talking us through their experiences, their challenges and tips across a really broad range of habitats and landscapes. And I'll introduce them in a moment, but before I do, Dan Barwick from DEFRA is going to share a few words about the IRF and what's next. So Dan, over to you.
Thanks, Helen. Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Barwick. I work in DEFRA's Green Finance team, and I'm pleased to have the opportunity to give you a brief intro to the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which we're currently in the process of designing to open for applications in the new year. I'll make this quick, and apologies to those of you who have heard me say this as part of the previous sessions. So first, a big thank you to the GFI for leading these sessions, and for the expert panelists, and to the EKN for hosting as part of the conference, and congratulations on another very successful conference. The GFI, on behalf of DEFRA and the Environment Agency, are hosting 2 further breakout sessions to conclude this webinar series on the IRF. These will be held over the next fortnight and will facilitate discussion with potential applicants and intermediaries on how to create investable project models, and will provide details of how to book at the end of this session. So a very quick introduction to the Investment Readiness Fund. At its core, the IRF will be a competitive grant programme to enable natural environment project developers to boost their capacity and procure the specialist advice and expertise they need to develop their project to the stage that it's ready to receive and operate on repayable investment. So it will be a technical assistance programme rather than a fund that makes capital investments into projects on the ground. We're interested in receiving bids from projects that can broadly do 2 things. Number 1, protect and enhance the natural environment in line with the goals of the 25-year environment plan. And number 2, generate revenue from ecosystem services in order to attract and repay investment. The aim being to increase the funding options available for natural environment projects. So the exact investment readiness needs will vary from project to project, but could include support and advice on things such as financial modelling, revenue generation, investment structuring, capital raising, governance advice, investor due diligence, impact measurement, etc., etc. We've drawn inspiration from the social investment sector, which has grown rapidly over the last 10 or 15 years, supported by public investment readiness funding. And while we see this kind of capacity and capability building support as a crucial step in helping to build a pipeline of investable natural environment projects, we realise it's only one part of the support needed, and that we need to align other sources of public funding to enable blended investment, and we need the right enabling policy and regulation, as we've heard a few times at the conference this week. So I'll leave it there for now. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion, and as I said, we'll provide info on the further breakout sessions later on today. Thank you. Back to you, Helen.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you so much. So I'm really pleased to introduce our 4 presenters for today in the order they will appear. So we have David Baxter, Director of Operations Entrade, Lee Dudley, Head of Environmental Carbon at Woodland Trust, Harry Barton, Chief Executive of Devon Wildlife Trust, and Tom Dillon and Ben Stafford of Regenerate Asset Management. And each are going to be presenting for about 10 minutes. And we'll have a Q&A at the end. So rather than save your questions for the end, we encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A option box while the presenters are speaking, and we'll collect those at the end and choose 2 or so for each presenter. That will allow us to stay on track. If it's unclear who your question is aimed at, please just note the name of the presenter in your question. Also, we're only taking questions today on the projects and not on the IRF. If you have questions about the IRF, we're going to provide an email at the end, and share the details, as Dan mentioned, on the breakout sessions that will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. We also have a poll that we're asking applicants to take part in at the end of this session to see how helpful these have been. So please do stay and share that feedback, because it will help us understand what more we can do to support the application process. But on to our presenters. Our first presenter today, as I mentioned, will be David from Entrade, sharing about catchment markets and stacking benefits, specifically a project in the Hampshire Avon. Thank you so much for joining us today, David, and over to you.
Mute. David didn't need to be reminded. He knew what he was doing. Good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Entrade. I can't actually see the slides. Are they up on screen at the moment?
They should be now. Can you see them, David?
I can't see them. That's okay. I can work without that. Don't worry. Okay, so we can go to the slide that's slide 2, please, which is overview, and I'll just give a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about. Okay, so just a little bit about Entrade. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about our experience in measures to reduce phosphorus. That's slightly different to our name. We started off trading in nitrogen, but I'll talk about what we've done to get investment in measures to reduce phosphorus. And then as a consequence of that work, what we've learned about making investable propositions. Then finally, I'll finish off by saying there is, where next for us, which is catchment markets. So if I could just move to the slide about Entrade, just the slide that says about our history. So I'll just give a little bit of a talk about that. Entrade started in 2015. It's a subsidiary of Wessex Water. We started to basically help Wessex Water do deals with farmers to reduce nitrogen releases with cover crops. We created a trading platform which allowed farmers to make bids, to manage contracts, and to basically optimize the process so that we bought nitrogen, the most effective nitrogen measures, rather than just a plain old area of land. And as a consequence of making the process simpler and slicker, we reduced sort of the admin costs by about 40%, but we also reduced the price of outcomes by 40%. And more importantly, we made it available for every farmer, and now about 80% of the catchment land that would be eligible for this scheme is regularly entered into markets. And this is supported by major IT investment, which helps us do these deals and keep things simple and secure. And we've been using the learning from each market event to keep on making it more and more farmer friendly. So we've got loads and loads of evidence now about how people behave in markets, how they actually make bids. So we've structured the platform to help them do that. So I'll go to the next slide, which is just some of our clients there. And just to say that there are people out there buying environmental services, and their water industry, clearly that's where we've come from, but there are the developers market, the NGO market, government itself, of course, and increasingly we're finding local authorities understanding that actually to free up credits not just for biodiversity but for phosphorus and nitrogen is really vital for their house building program. Just to the next slide. I won't dwell on that. That's just part of what we are as a business. We're using good sound science, so we actually understand what it is we're buying and selling. We're using really good close relationships with farmers to get them involved, bring them to market, and we've got the IT and the understanding of how markets work. That's all about the business of actually making trades happen slickly and quickly. Okay, so we just skip through to there's a slide there about our trading solutions. I won't dwell on that because I think we want to get through to the actual practical bits. So if we just go to the first slide, which the slide 9, which is Brinkworth Brook Phosphorus Grant Scheme. This was our first experience of trading in phosphorus. It is backed by Wessex Water. It's a 5-year project. Basically, you see the area there. It's placed not far from Swindon, Royal Wootton Bassett, top end of the Bristol Avon catchment. And we've basically been using our knowledge of how phosphorus flows in the landscape and how different interventions like buffer strips, woodland actually stop that phosphorus entering water, so that we can actually credit the amount of phosphorus being removed. And that's enabled us to engage with landowners and say, yeah, this is how you get a good deal here. If you do these types of measures, we're more likely to pay you money. So that the platform actually makes it clear to the farmers where they can apply, and more importantly, tells them if they're winning, and they're winning on the basis of, is it likely that their scheme, that their measure is doing good things. So we use that learning from Brinkworth Brook, which is a pilot scheme with one buyer, Wessex Water, and a bunch of farmers. And we took it into, the next slide please, the Hampshire Avon, which is a habitat site, and it's got a big phosphorus neutrality requirement on it. We found there got multiple people needing phosphorus offsets, Wiltshire, MOD, Wessex Water itself. So we basically went through the process saying, well, you're going to get multiple buyers. How's this going to work? So we had a bit of facilitation with Lens, Landscape Enterprise Network Solutions, and we used the kind of local partners to get the farmers engaged, saying, look, this is what you can do. Getting multiple buyers is a tricky business, and that everyone talks about being able to stack buyers, but I'll tell you what, it's not easy. You've got different requirements, you've got different procurement rules, and farmers don't typically want to contract with multiple parties at the same time. We came up with a market design where we basically ended up with two buyers.
David, I'm just going to stop you there. We're having trouble hearing you right now. I don't know if, I can see you're not muted. I don't know if there's a challenge with your headset. Just wait for David to check whether we can hear him again. Don't know if you want to unplug your headset and we'll see if that works, David. Sorry about this. I'm amazed we haven't had more technical glitches, actually, given how many people have been talking over these few days. No, still not hearing you. What we might do then is move on. We'll just give you a couple more moments, David. If not, we'll...
That's better. Is that working?
That's it. You're back. You're back. You're back. So I'm sorry if you could sort of go a slide back and start from. That's it. Perfect. Thanks. Thanks. That's it. Thanks, David.
Sorry about that. So I'm on Brink. Have you got the Brinkworth Brook slide up now?
We've got the Hampshire Avon phosphorus contract scheme that you should be able to see in. Yeah. Okay. Great.
I can't see it. I don't know where it's going on my screen. But I can't see it. But nevertheless, so this is Hampshire Avon, habitats protected site in Wiltshire and Hampshire. We worked there with, but basically understanding. Well, there are multiple buyers in the form of Wiltshire Council, who wants to unlock housing development. Similarly with the MOD, massive house building programme there for army relocation, and Wessex Water's normal water framework directive compliance issues there. So we built attempted to build a buying consortium with Lens, and at the same time also got the supplier side, the farmers engaged with some contractors using CSF, Catchment Sensitive Farming Scheme, and Black Sheep Consulting, to go out there and build it. So the key here is getting two sides of the market involved. And I'm still here. So in getting them together, we actually negotiated, found out it's really hard to get multiple buyers to contract for the same measure. So we ended up coming up with a market solution where we had two buyers, Wessex and Wiltshire, where Wessex were going to buy the short-term measures and Wiltshire were going to buy the long-term measures. So that was an imperfect solution, but that's what we had to come up with in this solution here. We saw bids come in for £500,000 worth of projects, and we assessed each of those projects against their ability to reduce phosphorus there. And that bottom graphic saying, you've got some measures yeah, that are a lot better than others at reducing phosphorus. In the end, we targeted wetlands because they're long term and we're meeting the habitat's requirements that which are needed. And we also targeted a minimum till system, which was going to save a lot of phosphorus for Wessex Water, even though you can guarantee it for long term. So again, it's about understanding those buyers, different buyers' needs. If you go to the next slide, just to show that the modelling process is at the heart of this, and actually understanding. Yeah, you've got to go do a lot of work with regulators and science to basically convince them that the reduction in phosphorus is a real reduction, and therefore you can rely on it for compliance with planning obligations and habitats regs and your consent. So that was a really important part of backing this up. It was very sound science trusted by the regulator. Okay, I'm not going to take a risk and just take this myself down to, you go down to the lessons learned slide. Hang on, I didn't mean to do that. Okay, so things we learned from this process. Number one is if you want to get people to invest, buyers to invest, you've really got to give them confidence, and that means convincing them that there's availability of supply, convincing them that you'll buy the supply in a competitive way, so you get good prices, and convincing that really you're building on local partnerships, that you're actually going to work with people on the ground. Linked to buyer confidence, of course, is to make sure you've got your regulator. If you're buying credits that regulators are going to need to rely on, you definitely need regulator buy-in. So that means convincing the regulators that you've got really good data collection, so you can model things properly. You've actually got good models in the first place, and then you're also regulators are also quite keen that you don't reward bad guys. So you've got to make sure you've got good eligibility processes to keep non-compliant farms out. And from a commercial basis, we had to build some quite clever contracts and buyer models to make sure that we could share the outcomes of the auction. And another last piece really is that we started to see the beginning of stacking. Whereas this measure was about buying phosphorus, we found what some of the most effective measures also had additional benefits, and it was the additional benefits of carbon that we got from the minimum till system that we bought that actually got that over the line. Wessex were probably just on the edge of deciding whether that was cost-effective phosphorus or not, but we said actually you can accredit a massive carbon gain here from the soil disturbance being avoided and the way that this reduces phosphorus needs across the whole catchment. We were able to credit the carbon from using a min-till system, and that really was worth quite a lot to Wessex because they are committed to net zero. Then linked to that final piece there is that using carbon standards from a soil basis on the basis of soil is tricky. We don't have a woodland carbon code yet in the UK that's equivalent for soil, but we are using VERA verified systems to accredit that carbon. So again, using those systems that people trust and know is absolutely key. I think I'm running out of time, but I'll just finish on the last two slides really on catchment markets. So if you just skip to slide, what would be 15, which is just a picture of the town of Parrett. As just to say, this is the evolution really, saying because we found the contracting so hard, we've ended up saying, well, actually, you've got to buy the contracts with farmers with one buyer and sell the credits separately to buyers of credits. So we've basically created a two-sided market, which has a number of benefits, which I won't be able to go into a lot of detail on now, only to say that this was our solution to dealing with uncertainty, to dealing with contractual complexity, but it's not without its own challenges. And I know it's been talked about at various points throughout the day, but that's where we're going to. And then the last slide, I want to finish on slide 16, which is to say, yeah, we are going live with this right now as we speak, getting farmers again. So again, demonstrating supply from the farmers, that's absolutely critical. And so there's a whole process of project registration we're going through there. And then on the right-hand side, we're also making sure we've got regulator buy-in and that we've got expressions of interest to actually buy credits on the right-hand side. So we're actually going to make sure we've got a matched market, but that's just really emphasising the need for supply side, buy side confidence, and the regulators in the middle there. Bottom bit, which I won't go on to, is that, yeah, so providing we get good expressions of interest, we'll go live with the market bidding process and settlement in March, and that will be fun. I'll stop there, and apologies for the technical glitches on sound.
Thank you, David. No problem at all. We're in perfect time, so you did an amazing job. And it's such a fascinating project and so many stakeholders involved. So I'm really excited to hear the questions that people are going to be posing to you later. And you mentioned carbon here, and our next presenter is going to be talking about carbon. So our next presenter is Lee Dudley with the Woodland Trust, who's going to be sharing about experience with the carbon code and finding buyers for carbon. So very much a very warm welcome to you, Lee, and it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Thank you for the title slide. I'll crack on if we move on to the next slide, please. Okay, I will set out in the presentation today a brief introduction to the carbon code, our experiences with the code so far, and also the opportunities going forward. The carbon code, I think as Scottish Forestry, Pat Snowden said earlier on today, yes, it's been around for a while. It was launched in 2011. There's over 190 projects already validated under the carbon code, representing some 13.1 million trees. So already an active program, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And it's predicted to sequester 3.4 million tons of carbon dioxide. Next slide, please. And I estimate that that's around about £196 million invested to date from the private sector. So quite a well-established scheme. But what is it all about? It's about the Woodland Carbon Code is a voluntary standard for UK woodland creation projects, and it's important to say this. It's where claims are made about the carbon dioxide-based sequester. So it's claims about what's happening in the future. The independent validation at the outset, supported by the verifications into the future, adds real security for investors, and that's really important in making this scheme work, is the integrity and the security. So there is a high level of integrity in the scheme, and as a consequence, I think that's why we've seen so much activity so far. Next slide, please. So the carbon code legitimizes and provides integrity for the investors who want to pay for enabling woodland creation, but it also provides that traceable and auditable element. It's a simple process on the face of it in terms of money leading to sustained delivery in the future, but actually it's a bit more detailed in practice. If we move on to the next slide. Okay, so it's a series of gated steps, really. It seeks to create a long-term management plan called a project design document, which assesses the need for investment and crucially, in fact, calculate the estimated carbon sequestration that will take place. The details are then submitted and registered on the global website, the IHS Market website, and then into the future, we have a verification and by accredited certifiers into the future. Next slide, please. So it all starts with a lengthy design document that covers not only the additionality of the project and the carbon income and expenditure, but also assesses, these are important factors for us, also assesses the ecological and societal outcomes from any of the proposals, which is a particular appeal for the Woodland Trust to operate this scheme. This does add value in analysing these bits of data. It provides feedback for the corporate so that they can see what they're actually getting for their money. But it is also time consuming in its production, and many project design documents are in excess of 30 pages long, so it is quite a lengthy process. Next slide, please. And this is the all-important calculation of carbon output as a consequence of going through the carbon code. I've used an example here of a 10-hectare site achieving 12,492 tonnes. One of the most important parts is this calculation of the carbon units, because it's related directly to the value of the investment. The way the Woodland Trust approach this is to take a conservative calculation in order to avoid any disappointments at verification and therefore disappointments with your corporate clients. The trust have found the calculations to be detailed, yet there are some weaknesses in conservation forestry terms. Species models are limited, as are the management regimes. The calculations as well do not always favour low density or riparian planting or perhaps agroforestry schemes. It is very much set up for a commercial calculation, but that is in an improving situation. Next slide, please. So once you've gone through the process, you register the project on the website. The documentation is assessed by auditors and Scottish Forestry before being displayed on the IHS Markit Global Environmental Registry. In this example I have here is a native woodland creation project the Woodland Trust led on in Northern Ireland, covering some 13.5 hectares, so rather modest in size. Next slide, please. And this slide illustrates the data that you can access. With one further click of the button on the public register, you not only can see the location and the site description, but also the tons of carbon dioxide equivalent sequestered and the prediction of that, which in this case with Focken Valley in Northern Ireland was 6,130 tons will be sequestered, possibly achieving around about £9,000 per hectare of investments. And that's in addition to government grants, so quite a welcome boost to the project. Next slide, please. And once you've gone through the validation process and you've predicted what carbon you're going to sequester, then that all-important verification process does kick in. By going through the process, you're basically promising, and I often say quite openly to corporate clients, that actually what we're selling you here is the dream, because the carbon units don't exist yet. They are further down the line. So the validation and followed by verification is a very, very important thing to have linked and explained to corporate clients. Next slide, please. So we come to verification. So this picture here illustrates a site we've just recently commenced verification on. The site is 5 years old, and that's the first verification point. It involves a sample point survey based on the area of net planting to assess performance, which is checked back against the original documentation that you put forward. Verification is a process we are beginning to understand in practice, and verification happens, as I said, at 5 years and then every 10 years thereafter for the lifetime of the project. And as I say, it really does provide that long-term comfort that this is a serious proposition for investment. Next slide, please. Okay, so our experience is income and corporate interest has been strong. As an NGO, as a trust, we are an attractive investment, and we do indeed have that advantage. But we're aware of increasing competition in the market because of its success, which is going to only further develop into the future. So I think the market will continue to grow. For us, the Woodland Trust, the land supply has been difficult. I think as an NGO, we watch our pennies and delivering what our members are paying for, and we'll always have that in the forefront of our mind in what we do in the delivery, especially in these times of where we are now. So, you know, we've found the land supply difficult, but on the corporate income is a boost, and it represents about 15. In some cases 15–25% of full project cost, but it's a significant contribution. And the carbon code processes and documentation are admittedly complex and time consuming, taking occasionally up to 3 months, and it does require time and resources to deliver that. Next slide, please. Woodland creation with verification in the future taking place, and that's reassuring, and the woodland expansion we're beginning to see across the UK is, and all its associated ecosystem services that are being achieved as a consequence, is is, I believe, and being enabled by the Carbon Code as a real sound mechanism to deliver. Next slide, please. Investors remain avidly interested in dealing with climate change and corporate social responsibility together. We have seen new contracts this year, despite the risks of COVID and recession, in recent months in particular. There clearly is a demand that has not significantly cooled in the last year, and this may be different from the private sector, as a trust can offer that CSR and brand association opportunities that perhaps the private sector are less able to do so. On the flip side, land supply is difficult, particularly for a trust, but generally in any case. And we've found that we are beginning to see quite serious land competition from speculative investors, whether they're involved in carbon or otherwise. But nevertheless, the carbon income is important in giving us confidence to purchase land to enable projects to take place. Next slide, please. I didn't want to touch on the Woodland Carbon Guarantee Fund in particular, but I will mention it in passing. It's a scheme that only takes place in England, but the last Guarantee Fund auction achieved a price around about £20 per tonne. So on a 10-hectare site such as the Woodland Trust would manage, that's potentially representing £70,000 in addition to normal government source grants. So the Carbon Code is a really strong tool for enabling the delivery both now and into the future. The Woodland Trust have registered 21 schemes in the Carbon Code to date, and we have validated 200,283 tonnes of carbon. We're stacking concepts coming forward and developing. I think the real financial and economic value of what we do is being recognised, and I think the Carbon Code provides an opportunity to develop similar schemes that can really enable environmental delivery. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lee. That's great to hear. And interesting, you said competition is increasing. Good and bad. But at least the demand is also increasing, and appreciate your reference to selling the dream. So moving on now from forests to wetlands and down to Devon. Welcome again to Harry Barton. Thanks for joining us today. Harry's going to be sharing about a project they're working on with Triodos that Dan alluded to yesterday, and the successes and challenges that they've had. So all over to you, Harry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen, and good afternoon, everyone. Yes, so my name is Harry Barton, and I'm going to be talking about a project called the Caen Wetlands project. It's a feasibility study, so we're at the moment, so slightly behind compared to where David and Lee others. So I won't be able to offer anything quite as clever as them, but anyway, what I'll try and do is take us a canter through the experience you've had so far. So the next slide, please. So this next slide, when it comes up, is just about us. We won't need to dwell on this, but we're a wildlife membership organisation. Our business is nature reserves, advising farmers on land. We're very familiar with that territory. We are not nearly so familiar with all this, the green finance stuff we've talked about. So this is very much a learning experience for us. Next slide, please. So the area we're talking about here is North Devon. This is the Tor and Torridge Estuary, very special area, well known from surfers, of course. You've got Croyd, Willicombe and Saunton Sands around here. It's one of only four UNESCO biosphere reserves in the country. And our project is right in the middle of this slide here, just on the right-hand side. So next slide, please. And on the left-hand side here, you can see all the designations on the Torridge Estuary. This part of the country is designated to the hilt. So that yellow bit you can see on the left-hand side, that's Saunton Sands, and behind that is one of the most important areas of dunes anywhere in Europe. And you might just be able to see two dark bits of green on the right-hand side there, and those are the focus of our project. But this estuary is incredibly important ecologically, very important as a high tide roost, very dynamic, but also rapidly changing. Next slide, please. And one of the many reasons it's changing is because of sea level rise. Now, you probably won't be able to read this, but there are 3 different scenarios here. The top, the columns say RCP 2.6, 4.5. These are just emissions scenarios, low, medium, and high. At the moment, where projection is looking towards the high end, and you've got the 5th and the 95th centile. So the 95th centile is really at the high end. But you can see if you look at Cardiff, which is probably the most relevant one to where we are here, we're looking at anything up to a metre plus in the coming decades in terms of sea level rise. And for a low-lying area like this, that is very, very significant. Next slide, please. And one of the many reasons it's significant, of course, is because coastal squeeze. So the sea level has come up and down in the past, and we've got spring tides and neap tides and all this stuff we know about. But what's changed in recent years, as we all know, is you've got these fixed things in the landscape. So these sea walls, either to protect property or farmland or whatever it might be. But as the sea level rises and the seawall stays in the same place, these incredibly important habitats, that intertidal zone where you get the salt marsh and the wetlands and all these other critical features, these are getting squeezed, these are shrinking because they cannot move inland. Next slide, please. Now, the area that we're talking about for this project is delineated here by these 2 red areas. So the one in the southwest, that's the bottom left-hand corner, that's called Horsey Island. Slightly, it slips slightly off here, but you can see just underneath it, it's the green area. And then the one to the northeast, that's Chivenham Marshes. And the reason why there's a break between the 2 is you've got the River Caen coming down and joining the main River Tor estuary just to the south. And over on the left-hand side, you can see this very rough area, and that's all the Braunton Barrows dune system. Next slide, please. Now, what we're trying to create through this, what we want to create is an exceptional wetland habitat, visitor facilities, and access trails. Now, it might surprise you to learn that when you get away from the coastline here, there's actually very poor offers for the visitor. The footpath network is pretty poor, apart from the Southwest Coast Pass. There's very little to attract a visitor when you get away from the beach. So this is what we want to try and offer here, very much a high quality tourist offer. Next slide, please. And this is the sort of thing we want to create. So at the moment, on the top, on the bottom right-hand side, you can see what hopefully looks to you like a lovely bit of wetland with some boardwalk going through it. At the moment, the land we're looking at is quite intensively grazed farmland, not particularly high quality though. Very, very little, or if anything, like what we're looking at in these slides here. And in the bottom left, you can see a very small visitor centre. This isn't one of ours. This is at Arn, but it's a very successful visitor centre. And I think the point I want to make here is it doesn't have to be big and costly to be profitable. Sometimes it's something modest is exactly what you want, and that's the sort of thing that we're looking at for this landscape here. 6 million visitors come here, £500 million got into the local economy, but very little of it comes anywhere near the bit of land that we're looking at. Next slide, please. Now, an interesting thing happened almost 3 years ago to the day, which is there was a breach in the sea defences. So this is Horsey Island much more recently. Obviously, we're looking at a spring tide here, and the breach is in the far distance. You can't quite see it. But this land was all improved farmland. And now look at it. It's like a gigantic 200-acre lake. You can see that long straight, what was the outer wall of the sea defences, the breaches in the far side. And on the inside, on the left-hand side of the slide here, you can see what's now the official flood defence. And you can see, if you look carefully, that all the land to the left of that, all the land to the north would be inundated by the spring tide if that sea wall wasn't there. So it's really quite dramatic to look at this now. Next slide, please. Now, this bit of land had been on the market. Next slide, please. This bit of land had been on the market and for rather a lot of money. And what happened, of course, is that its agricultural value just disappeared. And it's now turned into this very large and incredibly dynamic area of tidal creeks and mud flats and salt marsh, which is rapidly developing. Devon Wildlife Trust, the organisation I work for, we bought this a year ago. Because it wasn't really wanted by anyone else for anything, and we thought, what a fantastic place for nature, and indeed it is. And now you can see flocks of 2,500 lapwing and golden plover circling above this on a regular basis. And this really changed the way this project was moving quite significantly. Next slide, please. But something else has been happening as well in the meantime, and that's because as the water's been coming in on the inside, it has been attacking these walls. Now, these sea walls were designed to take the impact from the outside, not from the inside. And so, as you can see here, it's starting to slump. And I can tell you, this slide was taken a few months ago. I can tell you that this now looks very, very different. All that vegetation on the left-hand side has gone, and we're expecting a second breach to happen anytime soon. And this is, again, has started to change the way our project is going. Next slide, please. So what's the Environment Agency's view on this? Well, as far as the Environment Agency is concerned, this wall is not an official sea defence, so they don't mind what happens to the seawall. And as far as the inner wall is concerned, which is the current sea defence, their attitude is that they should hold the line for the next 5 years or so, and after that, we should be looking at managed realignment. So this is obviously a threat in some ways, but it's also an opportunity for a project like this. Next slide, please. Now, if that inner bank goes, we are looking at a very significant area of land potentially being inundated, not on every tide, but certainly on the highest tides. So you might be able to see, if you look carefully, this thing which now looks like a leaf. And if you look at the midriff of the leaf, that is where that's the inner boundary of Horsey Island. Everything to the north would be inundated on a reasonably regular basis by the tidal waters if this land, if the sea defences breach. Next slide, please. So we started looking at our beneficiaries and the services we could provide, and this slide was put together before this latest breach happened. So we've been looking, the main one we've been measuring on is, or majoring on rather, is access to high quality green space, the one you see at the bottom. Carbon sequestration was becoming more important too when we saw how fast that the salt marsh was accreting. But some of these flood benefits or potential flood benefits or issues are coming into the fore as well. And I think what's really changed since we first started putting this together is the whole risk profile of this project and the local stakeholders has changed enormously. Next slide, please. So we have sought the advice of various useful people on this. Helen mentioned Triodos, who've been absolutely brilliant. So I would highly recommend getting a bank or someone who really understands the nature of what you're dealing with here on side. So we work very closely with Triodos. We've also been working very closely with some hydrogeomorphologists. So there's an organisation, APBMER, they're based up in Bristol, and they've been doing some in-depth mapping and looking at the risk profile around here. So what might be the impact of a second or third breach? How is it going to affect the inner bank, which is the main flood defence? What other properties might be at risk? These are all things that we have to think about with a potential coastal realignment project like this. And also, how fast is habitat like salt marsh likely to accrete, and how do you build that into your modelling? Next slide, please. So in terms of what's been difficult for us, what's been challenging, I mean, all sorts of things have been difficult and challenging, and not all to do with the finance, I have to say. So permissions, we looked at repairing the banks before the things got much more serious. It took us 9 months to get permission, 6 different organisations. That made it very, very difficult to get things done quickly in a project like this. Fear and uncertainty, they are not your friends when you're dealing with a project like this, because what you really want is to get people around a table and to look at the long-term consequences and look rationally at how likely is it that that I'm going to get flooded? What's the cost of repairing a seawall versus the cost of my land? What options might be available to me? Fear gets in the way of those kind of discussions, so that has made it difficult. And we still get people who are absolutely convinced that because we've got a potential breach in our outer wall that the local villages are going to flood. They're not, and there's no evidence that they will, but these myths do persist. And historic rights, there are shooting rights all over this land. That doesn't half make it difficult when you're trying to get things done. So a lot of just very practical things, as well as the financial stuff, that has made this challenging for us. And the next slide, please. And this really is the last slide. Just in what we've learned so far, we've learned lots so far, and I'm sorry I've had to skim over most of it very quickly, but just some things that would really help going forward. Greater clarity on financial markets and payments for carbon offsets. I mean, it's fantastic to hear all the stuff we've got on peat, and as we heard from Lee a minute ago about woodland, but there are many other habitats where it's much, much less clear. Some clarity on that would enable the modelling to be much easier. incentives to landowners to engage and manage realignment. I mean, at the moment, if you're a landowner and you're looking at a potential breach to sea defence, often you only see the negatives, but the positives to a wider society and over a landscape scale might be much, much greater. But unfortunately, you end up dealing with individuals who see this very much as a threat. So we need some incentives to bring people to the table to make it easier to do those difficult negotiations. Blended finance is all part of the game, and if we can blend other forms of finance with agri-environment schemes, that would be very useful. And also looking at conservation covenants and easements. There's all sorts of things they've been using in the States for ages, to for decades, for this kind of project, and it would be great if we could roll these out in the UK as we go forward. So whistle stop forward. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Harry. It was really, really interesting. It was so nice to see the work you're doing, and to hear that, it's not only finance that is the challenge, it's of course also policy levers would help too. Thank you very much. And so finally, we're going to be talking about sustainable agriculture and soil with our final presentation from Tom Dillon and Ben Stafford at Regenerate Asset Management, and they're going to be sharing about potentially an environmental impact bond, which we heard a little bit about on Tuesday as well. So thanks for joining us. Over to you, Tom and Ben.
Thank you, Helen. We've only got one slide. No. Yeah, thank you, Helen, and everyone who's been involved setting this up. It's great to be on this panel. Ben and I will talk briefly about Hadrian Bond. So Hadrian Bond is an environmental impact bond centred around regenerative agriculture in the English borders. Some of you will already know about how EIBs work, and will have listened to Eric Letzinger at Quantified Ventures talk yesterday. We will try to highlight the relevance of this type of funding to current reforms of the UK agriculture sector, and give a basic run of our assumptions and aims of the bond. So, as we are aware, the 2018 Agriculture Bill has set in a motion of reform for the UK farming subsidies. The basic payment scheme is being phased out and replaced by the Environmental Land Management Scheme, or ELMS, which will be subsidising farmers for supplying ecosystem services. So with this, DEFRA has a significant burden to oversee these reforms and accurately forecast and measure ecosystem services, as well as remunerate the farmers for supplying them. If we add to this the complexity of exiting the EU and the prospect of severe budgetary pressures after COVID, we can assume that these policy reforms are placing unprecedented pressures on DEFRA. So this picture painted here has parallels with the emergence of EIBs in the States about 5 years ago, following similar overhauls in environmental legislation. At that time, federal water directives were introduced, imposing very strict requirements for river water quality. And the state water authorities were struggling to remedy and comply with these new regulations. So Quantified Ventures came in and introduced private investors to fund innovative and untrialled methods to improve water quality. This involved, for example, building green infrastructure upstream and within the cities themselves, instead of the construction of grey infrastructure, such as concrete flood defences, to prevent sewage overflows. Because the state water authorities publicly funded, they were understandably averse to spending their budgets on riskier, untrialled methods, which had no proven record of success. So the buck was passed to investors to fund these methods under an EIB, and these investors are now being repaid by the water authorities for specified levels of improved water quality, linked to the green infrastructure which was funded by the bond. In this way, the budgets of government agencies are protected and reserved only for successful outcomes, and a portion of project cost and risk is transferred to private investors. So it's in this context that we propose an EIB approach to conscript co-financing parties to lighten the burden on DEFRA to deliver ELMS. The first of these parties is the institutional investor, looking beyond the woodland and peatland codes to sustainable agriculture. Importantly, these investors can be far removed from agricultural supply chains, unlike some other ecosystem service models. Another party is the non-governmental beneficiary, similar to what Trade were talking about earlier. And these beneficiaries are the payers under the bond, providing the revenue streams to pay down the debt of the bond, as this diagram shows. The method funded under Hadrian Bond, and which is untrialed by DEFRA, is regenerative agriculture. It's a big subject which we can't cover in this time frame, but simply put, regenerative agriculture is a way of farming the farm as a whole ecosystem, using biological, not chemical inputs. And we're partnering with a global network of practitioners to train and assess farms for their regenerative performance. This way of farming delivers the full range of ecosystem services, and there is a seamless alignment with ELMS in this regard. And we are presenting this bond as an ELMS accelerator. It's also worth noting that one of the advantages of an EIB is the way it front loads capital, and this can provide cushion finance for the farmers as contractors. Switching to regenerative practices carries risk for a farmer, and DEFRA themselves are questioning the sustainability of payments by results schemes, or PBR schemes, which have been tested on a small scale in recent years. What if the outcomes aren't hit, essentially? And if we link back to the examples of the US bonds, an EIB can transfer some of this risk of failed outcomes to investors. These investors have appetite for risk and reward. So why Hadrian Bond? It's partly inspired by the European Green Belt, which tracks the Iron Curtain through various countries in Europe, and is one of the world's major biodiversity corridors. In the same way, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, such as Hadrian's Wall, appeals to investors who are thinking big to tackle the crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. There are also economic reasons in that farm business surveys have shown that farms in this region are particularly vulnerable to the withdrawal of basic payment subsidies. Poorer grade land up here inevitably yields lower returns from commodity production. So many farms in the region are heavily reliant on BPS to stay solvent. We do not yet know if ELMS will sufficiently compensate for the reduction of BPS in the coming years, and we don't want to wait to find out. So it's our aim that the Hadrian Bond will stimulate the rural economy and protect farming livelihoods. I'll pass over to Ben. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I mean, at the moment we're in a period of entering the preparation of our first pilot for this project, focused on the north of England, and we're hoping this will have a dramatic impact on not only environmental services but also the rural economies. Just a little bit about Regenerate. Regenerate is a sustainable finance company founded in 2019. And really we're targeting themes beyond the conventional wind and solar investments that we all know so much about these days within this market. Our main focus is natural capital, where amongst the kind of list of opportunities we're looking at, our two main targets are environmental impact bonding and also a private equity platform which invests directly into the farms. Our team has a long history of kind of private market investments, renewables, agriculture, insurance, and sustainability. all which are kind of very important when you're coming to a project such as this kind of EIB that Tom has described. Regenerative farming investments, if they're well structured, we believe they can deliver excellent commercial returns to investors, which should kind of add growth to the sector, but also provide a huge number of positive impacts, especially many of those in the kind of UN Sustainable Development Goals. So kind of in quick summary, we believe we've got a couple of investable areas which are kind of able to deliver change, move the UK towards a kind of more of a net zero direction, while also kind of impacting positively local rural communities. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you, Tom. I really just really appreciate you. There are some things you can't share with us because of where it is in its journey. But thanks for giving us the bone, and I know there's some questions coming in that we'll get to in a second. So on that, we do have a lot of questions. I'd like to welcome back all the panelists. Thank you again for joining us and sharing today. We're going to take, we've got about 20 minutes, that's not so bad. We're going to take a couple of questions each, and we'll go around, and if we've got time, we'll carry on going. David, a lot of questions have come in for you, so you're going to be first back in the seat. This one's from Mary Christie of Nature Scott. Given your experience with the difficulties of multiple buyers, how do you see the lens model evolving, or is it the catchment market approach? Is the catchment market approach an evolution of the lens model, and where do regional governance structures fit in?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Good.
Yes.
That's a nice, simple question. I'll do my best. I think lens I see it as a facilitation system that brings people together, and so I think it adds a lot of value when it does that, but it doesn't actually create a buying solution. So catchment markets is actually something that evolved to deal with the fact that lens doesn't create that central buying position. So it's an evolution in that respect. I think, well, from what I know about lens, is that it is following another solution, which is to kind of create special purpose vehicles to operate as a single buyer. I think that's fine. That will certainly work for single outcomes, perhaps less regulatory ones. The way we've developed the ideas behind the catchment market is that if you've got the market backing all the credits you're selling, then you can build the buffers in there. You can build a lot more regulatory certainty. So we feel that in terms of meeting planning obligations and regulatory obligations, the market is a more robust solution.
Thanks, David. And there's another one here from Simon Whiteman of Esme Fairbairn Foundation. The Entrade model offers flexibility to those looking to offset their nutrient emissions. In most catchments, you also need a reduction of emissions from farming. How does Entrade ensure a reduction in the farm contribution if farmers contribute their reduction to industry industry offsets?
Okay, well, I think what you're touching upon there is that for a market to work, you need market rules. And so we're working very closely with the regulators, with the Environment Agency and Natural England, to establish and say, well, what counts as the baseline from which a farmer's activity can be credited as over and above what should already be happening. So that's the way we, if a farmer is selling offsets elsewhere, that's fine. But first and foremost for us is agreeing the baseline performance of the farm systems, and then crediting from above that. So this, I suppose, that answers some of the bit about the regional governance question previously as well, saying so you need market rules, and you need a group that's acting as the governance of that market, so that you know how you're calculating your credits, you know how you're verifying delivery. We could go on more, but that's the basic element of it. Really, is having good baselines, good accreditation, and clear market rules.
Right. Thanks, David. And we may come back to you in a moment if there's time. Then I've got a question here now for Lee from Rebecca Mason of Eunomia. Given national tree planting targets, how can the Woodland Carbon Code prove additionality of private carbon offsets?
The additionality is treated at a project, at a site level, at a project level, project site level. So the costings in the additionality calculation for the carbon code are based on an individual level. Having said that, I think the investment that's and the interest that we're seeing out there at the moment does demonstrate that you know, the willingness is there from the private sector if we can supply the land and achieve what government's trying to achieve across the various policies they have in place at the moment. And I think that's a good thing. And the additionality is in achieving that goal on its own, really. I mean, we're a country pretty well depleted of woodland in the past. We've got an improving situation, but it needs to improve a lot more.
And thanks, Lee. Another one here from Sarah Dubray, Paris Impact Investing. What are your corporate clients doing with their woodland carbon credits?
Well, yeah, there's actually quite clear guidance from Scottish Forestry, who administer the carbon code, about what you can say where you're making investments and it's actually a promise to deliver the carbon units. So forgive me, I won't be able to recall the specific statements from the carbon code, and perhaps I shouldn't. But yes, those organisations can make a claim that they are working towards achieving their goals in terms of their carbon budget. So they can certainly make some claims, but they're not as explicit as if they were buying verified woodland carbon units that come down the line a bit further on in time. It does make it quite difficult for organisations who've got quite tight timelines on achieving their carbon neutrality, but at least they're working towards them. Great.
And I'll just squeeze this one in. You did mention that maybe there were plans to extend, or it would be nice to extend, the Woodland Carbon Code. There's a question here from Alison Smith, University of Oxford. What improvements are planned to extend the Woodland Carbon Code, do you know, to agroforestry, low density planting, or less intensive management?
Yeah, nothing concrete at the moment, but certainly we've had discussions with Scottish Forestry where we would like to present the case really for those, let's say, non-conventional woodland creation schemes of low density agroforestry, etc. To me, in my mind, obviously, as a conservation forestry background, it makes sense to do that. We've got a really good mechanism here that works and functions well. It has appeal, it has integrity, it's robust. So yeah, I think really it should be fairly easy to roll out the other areas of forestry practice. Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm not talking out of turn here and saying those conversations have been fairly positive so far. So yeah, let's crack on with that work.
Thanks, Lee. Harry, question here for you. How did you choose an advisor when you landed on Triodos? How did that selection process take place?
Very good question. Well, so I should have mentioned this is a feasibility study that has been funded by Environment Agency, DEFRA, and the Esme Fairbairn Foundation. And as part of that process, we agreed that we would do a competitive tender to find an appropriate financial advisor. We went through that tender process, and Triodos won. And Triodos have been very good, but there were many other good players out there as well.
Okay, thanks. Any particular anything you were looking for in particular?
Well, I mean, you're looking for all sorts of things. I mean, it's a little while ago since we did it, but you know, you're looking for people who've obviously done this kind of work before, but you're also looking to what your next stage is. So where we're hoping to get to after this is an offer to to a bunch of investors, and those investors are probably not going to be the sort of standard commercial type of investor. They're more likely to be philanthropic investors, or people who are sort of partly philanthropic in their outlook. So you really want to do, in our case, we want to be dealing with someone who had experience with that kind of market. So it's perhaps slightly less transactional than some of the markets we might be dealing with, and that's one of the reasons, not the only reason, but that's one of the reasons why Triodos scored particularly well.
Great, thank you. And as a second question here, how did you purchase the land?
Oh, well, we purchased the land with the help of a major donor. So it was on the market for a phenomenal amount of money. And funnily enough, when there was a breach and all that agricultural land went under seawater and turned into mud flat and things like that, the value went right down as far as agriculture was concerned. But for an environmentalist like me, the value went right up. So I was delighted to get it for, well, we let's say we knocked a couple of noughts off the price of the land. Some people might say that was very stupid and we just bought ourselves a whole load of liabilities. But we did do our homework first and check what we're letting ourselves in for. But I think there's nothing like having a stake in the land where you're trying to do a project to give you a little bit more of an in with some of the neighbours. So now some of the people would be trying to persuade, talk to us, now have less of an option but to talk to us because we are their neighbour.
Great, thanks Harry. A couple of questions here for Tom and Ben. The first one from Dan Turner, Rivers Trust. I think we're guilty of focusing on buyers of ecosystem services and often forget sellers, farmers, landowners. How do we effectively engage, inspire and aggregate farmers to adopt a different approach and bring them along on the journey? Great question.
Tom, do you want to take that?
I'll try. Well, from my angle, the main reason we're looking at this is to raise the capital to reach a tipping point of incentives to help farmers switch to these methods. There are significant unknowns about elms being able to do this on a standalone basis. So if there is appetite with impact investors and other co-financing parties for this natural climate solution, if you like, of regenerative agriculture, let's raise that finance, but let's do it through a mechanism which we can sell to big institutional investors. I think that's part of the challenge with natural capital is the locality, the local restrictions, if you like, of some of these schemes, even though they deliver fantastic results. If we can appeal to the city and go beyond, that could be a tipping point. But without this capital, we can't aggregate the farms. That's my point. I think if we're relying on,
Absolutely, it's about aggregation, and it's also about training and guidance in order to make sure that what you're planning and what you're delivering is what the city wants as well. And I think there's a big issue of kind of lots of small bespoke projects that don't interest the city, and it's trying to essentially kind of aggregate and bridge that gap so that you know what is being looked for, and you're essentially trying to educate, guide and form a platform that then the city wants to invest in, or impact capital wants to invest in.
And you mentioned training of farmers in your presentation. So I just sort of piggybacking on this question, is there any more you can share about that?
Yes, we've got various partners, but the Savory Network are going to be our key partner for this. They have significant data from the States, and they also have methodologies which have been well tested over decades for training regenerative agriculture, but also assessing the farms. And that's a key part of this, is we have to have a gateway of performance to receive the payments.
Great, thank you. So we'll come back to you, David. Just scrolling up here. A question here from Archie Ruggles-Bryce, Sprains Hall Estate. Which methodology did you use to accredit the carbon in the mini-till system?
In the min-till, yeah, that's...
Oh, min-till, sorry.
I'm not the accreditation expert, but I think it was a variation of the cool farm. It's one of the cool farm tool approaches, But we've also been dabbling and looking at the DEFRA Institute's soil carbon methodology. It's a combination of two things, because it's a soil carbon and it's a kind of avoided fertilizer carbon calculation that we're doing. So it's a blend of the two. I think the message is, you know, the more these accreditation systems are used, the more likely that we can test, find out where the problems are. I mean, it's taken the Woodland Carbon Code is working brilliantly in that respect. Peatland Carbon Code has been slower to take off, but I suspect that will accelerate. So I think the more projects we can demonstrate use of accreditation systems that aren't perhaps familiar in the UK but have been used in the world. DEFRA system has been accredited since 2012. So you know, I think we've got to find the right buyers who are willing to say, yeah, this kind of I want carbon. I'm not desperately needing it for compliance purposes, but you know, let's get investing in here, and that's a quite. I think there's a lot of demand for that, particularly people wanting to buy locally sourced carbon. I think the offset market is going to shift away from these kind of global carbon offsets to having a bit more control and visibility of the offset projects. So I think the UK is an untapped market there that we need to start using.
Right, thank you. Thanks, David. Lee, a question from Chris Bowden here. Does the Carbon Code require one to start a woodland from scratch, or can it be a development or even rewilding of a current site?
Good question. So generally speaking, the Carbon Code is for new woodland creation, so sites that haven't had trees on for 25 years. So yeah, it is for new woodland creation. It works for natural regeneration as well. The start date being set as whenever the fence goes up, basically, and then using a verification method to ensure you've achieved stocking density. And then that's when the project starts in relation to carbon, is when you've achieved your set stocking density. So yeah, it works for natural regeneration as well.
Thanks, Lee. Harry, a question here. Well, there's just a couple. One is, have you done a study around the tourist centre to help you assess revenues that would be generated?
Yes, we're doing that at the moment. In fact, we've got 2 other visitor centres in other parts of the county where we're asking these questions very hard. And what's been really interesting is going back. We built a visitor centre 5 years ago and opened it, and we did lots of work around that. And reality turned out to be very, very different from what the experts said. So I think that's always a useful lesson to learn. So I think I would say those studies are really important, and we are doing them. But the main lesson I think we're taking is rather than to go in and build some great big thing, and because the experts tell you that you'll get X number of people coming, is to build something small and test it, and if it works, build on it, and if it doesn't, look at another location. So we're going to be testing a number of different locations around the area, and seeing where the draw is best, and we will build on that over the coming years. So there'll probably be 2 or 3 phases of build of that visitor centre.
Okay, thank you. We have just a couple of minutes, so I think I'll ask you this other one that's come in, Harry, for you, and then we'll come to Tom and Ben and wrap up. It's from Gwyn Williams, the RSPB, who we heard on Tuesday. Is there a benefit from restoring the wall with a spillway to using the Horsey Island as a regulated tidal exchange site to deliver for nature, but also mitigate impact of surges to Barnstaple and Bideford, etc.?
That's a great question, Will. And the answer is yes, we've looked at all sorts of options for that. So we've had people interested in renewable energy come and look at it. We've had people cost all sorts of different ways of fixing this. Unfortunately, we haven't come up with an answer that's workable financially, because the whole of the bank, the inner bank, that's about 2 kilometres of it, needs to be repaired, and the cost of that is about £2.5 million. And if you do the calculations of what you would generate from any renewable energy generation or any of these other things, it doesn't stack up. The payback just takes too long. So we've moved away from that, but that was certainly where I originally started with this, what I hoped we could do, because what I was hoping was we could have we could maintain that tidal habitat in Horsey Island, but sort of reduce the scour and the unpredictability of it. So that's one of the reasons why the project is moving in a rather different direction. So I think now we have to look at working with nature rather than trying to control nature, and we're looking at all sorts of options from from building up the inner bank and preventing any sort of breach, to looking at existing sluice gates, to even the possibility of a controlled breach. Haven't got buy-in for that locally yet, but I think we have to look at all these possible options and say, how does this stack up? Because I think if you look 25, 40, certainly 50 years ahead, the writing is on the wall for a lot of the farmland around there, because it's not going to be economic to maintain or keep strengthening the existing sea defences. So I think if we can look 10 years ahead and try and make a case that actually an alternative might be better, that's what we need to do. It's just a question of persuading people to come on board with it.
Thanks. Thank you, Harry. Tom and Ben, from Mary Christie, Nature Scott, how did you identify and bring together the beneficiaries who pay for the outcomes? Have you taken a landscape approach?
Yes, our approach has been very much a catchment based approach. It's also combined with, it's not just a kind of beneficiary approach, but also the farmer groups, obviously bringing farmers to a point where they want to move towards a regenerative approach is not always the easiest thing. So it's having a combination of open-minded farmers who want to do things better, and coming up with them, having a scalable approach, also to produce benefits that are needed, wanted by beneficiaries. So there's a little bit of been a kind of couple of years of trial and error on this, which Tom has led, and I think we're now getting towards a kind of stable, replicable business model that is possible to be scaled, not just amongst kind of mixed sites, but grazing sites and also arable.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. Okay, so that's about all we have time for today. And before we wrap up with our thank yous and details of what's coming next, we wanted to ask IFR applicants who are watching if you would take part in a quick poll. So, tech team, I wonder if we can bring up poll number 1. Thank you. On a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you understand what makes an investable model project? 1 being not well and 5 being very well. Brilliant, thank you. We'll just let that run another moment. And these are really helpful to us. Thank you very much. And the are we done now with this poll? Nope, still moving. Just give it a couple more seconds. Great. Okay, well, we'll stop the poll now and have our second poll. Thank you. On our next poll, please. On a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you understand the process for taking a project through to securing private investment? So how well do you understand the path to investment readiness? 1 being not well and 5 being nailed it. And while you're putting that in, I'll just sort of share with you then about the breakout sessions next week. So we're hoping that if you are still in the not well category here, that your questions can be answered in our breakout sessions next week. So we're hosting 2 on behalf of the EA and DEFRA on the 2nd and 9th of December. Those sessions are designed really to just for applicants to ask any remaining questions about the IRF with representatives from the EA and DEFRA will be there, and to facilitate discussion about how to monetize projects with other applicants and intermediaries in a much smaller groups. So if you don't have the details of how to join those, you're welcome to email, of course, irf@environment-agency.gov.uk, or you can email myself, helen.avery@gfi.green, or my colleague, Brendan Curran, brendan.curran@gfi.green, and you're welcome to join one of those 2 sessions on the 2nd or 9th of December. So just looking at the poll, seems to have stopped now. So great, it's a solid number 3. Thanks very much. We can let go of that poll now, and we'll take a look at that later. I really appreciate it. So that's it. Thank you so much for that feedback. It's really, really helpful. And thank you, audience, for joining us. And thank you so much to our presenters today. It's been really great hearing your stories, and a huge thank you to Bruce at EKN for hosting our sessions, and congratulations on a great conference. So if you are an IRF applicant, you will be receiving details of how to access recordings afterwards. They'll be hosted on the Green Finance Institute YouTube site, and you'll be receiving a summary of all the presentations this week. And you know where we are. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to us, or the IRF email, the Environment Agency. And so thank you all again for a really great week, and look forward to hearing more about your projects and seeing you all again soon. Thank you.